High-end motherboards. They give you everything. Overclocking abilities, high-end VRMs, some gimmicky but useful features, but most of all, they make your PC look pretty fucking cool. But this comes at a price, a pretty damn hefty price. This is, of course, unless you buy used. For only £25 to £30, you can purchase some of the most long-lived motherboards to have ever come out. The one I have here is the Asus M3A79T Deluxe. It cost me around £20, but originally came out for over £150 in 2008. It's based on socket AM2+, which means it supports all AM3 CPUs, even with the ability to overclock them. This means you can fit a 6-core Phenom in there for £50, or a quad-core Phenom for just £30. It supports up to 1066 MHz DDR2 memory, which rivals the bandwidth of early DDR3 memory. A great built-in sound card is included along with eSATA support, crash-free BIOS features, as well as a range of connectivity ports. But most of all, this board boasts some great overclocking features, which allow you to get the most power out of some of the weakest AM3 chips. Today we'll be pairing with the £15 AMD Athlon 2X4 620. It has a stock clock speed of 2.5 GHz and is based on the K10 architecture, which in turn is from the 45nm node. This is complete with the 4 cores and a 95W TDP, 512KB of L1 cache and 2MB of L2 cache, but most of all it has a locked multiplier, so overclocking this could prove to be a challenge for the board. All processors compatible with the AM2 Plus socket fit in the same way, so the AM3 Athlon here just slots right in. After installing the CPU, we paired it with a beefy Arctic cooler to keep it cool. It can support CPUs with a TDP of up to 175 watts, which I'm sure is enough to handle the modest clocks of this Athlon, as the Athlon itself can run completely fine up to 71 degrees centigrade. It clips on with a unique system which seems very odd at first, but actually works quite well. It allows it to just clip down on one side and the other side just tightens up nicely with a screwdriver. RAM-wise, we're opting for 6GB of DDR2 running at the 800MHz clock speed. It's rather high quality stuff, so should support overclocking quite nicely. However, cheaper sets may return you with some issues. Once again opting for our Corsair TX power supply, which has a large amount of voltage on a single 12V rail. Sure, it can't provide the same guarantee of power as the newer AXI series that many people use to overclock, but it's more than capable for overclocking, a process which requires you to have a good power supply to get the most out of your board and your processor. The hard disk drive is a standard Seagate one, so nothing special there, and just something to boot with. Of course, the GPU we're pairing with is my ATI Radeon R9 285. Next of all, we had to boot it up. We're once again running Windows 7 64-bit, as it's a lot more lightweight than Windows 10 on some of these older CPUs. Admittedly though, with some tweaks, Windows 10 would probably perform just about the same. Drivers were easy to get hold of, and a general Windows experience had virtually no difference from my Skylake i3 that I use on a day-to-day basis. We downloaded Open Hardware Monitor and Prime 95 so that we could begin our overclocking. It was around this point I realised I'd accidentally plugged the CPU fan into the case fan header, which is why I was getting an error. We were aiming to hit 3.1 GHz as we only have the option to BLC-K overclock, which for those that don't know will affect every part of the system from graphics throughput to the CPU clock speed. Hell, it'll even affect your USB ports, with devices not working if you do raise it too high. Booting up worked fine with 2.8 GHz on the overclock, and I felt at least booting was enough for us to push it a little bit further. So grabbing another cup of coffee, we sat back down and upped the clock speed to 3.1 GHz. Booting up to Windows once again worked fine, so we ran Prime 95 to test for an hour, and over this time we saw temperatures slowly raise up to 59 degrees, eventually topping out at 60.5 degrees at the very end. So I know what you're probably thinking now, we still have 10 degrees of headroom to mess around with. But unfortunately, if we mess around any further, the wireless USB adapter just stopped working due to, as I said, the USB ports being raised due to the BLC overclock and some very complicated things actually going on. So we decided to leave it at this clock speed for the remainder of our test, as we already had a rough 25% increase in power from this. So, with the overclock sorted, let's get on with some benchmarks. First up we have CSGO, which saw averages of 79 frames per second running with a mixture of medium and high settings in the 1080p resolution. At the very worst of times it came down to 62 frames per second, which had no issues at all, we had no stuttering, and altogether the experience was incredibly nice. Any previous source games to this will return you similar if not better results, as CSGO has proven to be the most intensive of them. Up next is something a bit more intensive with Grand Theft Auto 5. We saw averages of 42 frames per second, with minimums down to 32 frames per second when a lot was actually going on. All aspects of the game were more than playable, with visuals and performance that were better than that of the Xbox One or PS4 consoles, as was ran with high settings in the 1080p resolution with no stutters or dips in frame rate, even when explosions were going on. Fallout 4 is up next, which is slightly more intensive on older CPUs than that of Grand Theft Auto 5, running on high settings with FXAA at the 1080p resolution. Averages remained at 35 frames per second in our session, with it getting even higher in less built up areas. The heaviest areas in game brought our game down to 26 frames per second at the very worst of times, but for the most part did remain above or around 30 frames per second, so in no way would I class this as bad performance, as I hardly noticed these dips occurring. Doom for some reason refused to start in Vulkan mode, so we're running in no OpenGL mode. However, even with this the game did not disappoint. Averages stayed around 40 frames per second, with minimums down to 34 frames per second at the very worst of times. This was with the high settings at 1080p, and for a recent game that came out 8 years after the release of this processor, I was more than happy with this performance, as there was no stuttering. Altogether it was a lovely and playable experience. However, next up we have a test which I haven't really ever done before. OBS here, which I decided to give a test at least, as for £15 I wasn't expecting to get playable frame rates in a game as well as a decent-ish recording. We opted here for a 12,000 kilobit a second bitrate, a 1080p canvas and a 60 FPS capture setting, all with the help of the AMD VCE encoder which is on the graphics chip. And honestly, I was surprised. We recorded a CSGO game as it's already very CPU intensive as it is, but not only did we get a solid 60 FPS in game, we also achieved a flawless 60 FPS recording, which you can see here running in the background. Sure, it's not as crisp as what you may see captured from my own PC, but I'd be more than happy with this footage if it's the most I could muster from my PC in general. So, is it worth buying these high-end boards? Admittedly, I'm going to say yes, they are aging, but with prices hitting as low as £20 and performance of the budget CPUs being highly comparable to that of a current gen console, they're very, very good. Admittedly, they aren't amazing compared to today's standards, but they're comparable to that of a first gen i3 or even a very early i5 for as little as £15. All the CPUs do overclock greatly, but do consider that you will need better cooling and some high quality RAM, which could add to the price overall. And for the novelty of them, I'd say it's worth it on that alone, not to mention you can have 4-way crossfire setup for such a low cost. But do consider LGA 1155 or 1156 boards, as not only do they support DDR3 memory, they have a better sense of longevity thanks to their higher single core performance, but unfortunately that does come at a price. So I'd mainly opt for AM2 if you're sticking to an extreme budget. Thank you very much for watching, good night! And if you enjoyed this, why not like and subscribe for more? There's also a Patreon if you want to help out the channel.